This is Duke University.
I'm Bruce Lawrence. I'm a professor Islamic Studies Emeritus at Duke University, and I'm pleased to be talking here, having an interview with Nathan Hodge of the Wall Street Journal, and our topic is about Afghanistan. So Nathan, you've been there more recently than I. What's the play now? What's it like today?
Right, we're just a couple of weeks now into the formal election campaign. On April the 5th, there's slated to be the first round, or what's likely to be the first round of a presidential election that will decide who gets to succeed Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who has to step down this year. He's limited by the Constitution from running for another term. The field is quite wide open, and this is all happening at a very interesting time for Afghanistan. There are several transitions happening, not just a political transition. There is a military and a security transition, that is U.S. and international troops, combat troops that is, are leaving the country. International aid is slowly starting to wind down, and we've also got an economic sort of transition that's going to take place as well. Much of the economy over the past 10 to 12 years has grown up in Afghanistan around the business of aid. That is, a good chunk of the economic activity in this country is really around the delivery of aid and also the provision of services to the U.S. military and its allies. Some of the biggest businesses, for instance, that you have in Afghanistan are people who are doing things like delivering fuel to the U.S. military, or who are constructing bases, or doing U.S. military-funded reconstruction projects and internationally funded reconstruction projects. So that's going to shift, and it's unclear really what the model will be for Afghanistan to sustain itself as a state, because the country still depends in very large part on international aid to fund both the operations of its military and its police, as well as the operation of its government. So it's the international community that pays the salaries of the government here, the international community that pays for the military and the police to hold the line against what's still a very robust insurgency by the Taliban. And one final point sort of on all of these different transitions that are happening at once. If this election is successful in April, it will really mark the first genuinely democratic transition, that is between two sort of democratically elected, one government and another. And there are a lot of uncertainties about whether or not this will go off smoothly. There was extensive fraud in the 2009 election, and there's a fear that there could be a reprise of this. There could be an election result that a lot of the stakeholders would not find credible. So the question is open: will things continue to be stabilized, or will they be the prospects for, as you know, a return to the kind of violence that we saw in the Civil War of the 1990s? No one's saying that there will be a civil war yet. By no means is that really what's being talked about, but there is a worry that Afghanistan could potentially fragment if international aid dries up, if the army and the police stops receiving their salaries from the international community, and if the Taliban continue to mount a robust threat. At this point, they don't take and hold a whole lot of territory, but there are definitely parts of the country that are not under government control. So a lot of different factors here. Obviously, the U.S. and the international community have been heavily involved in Afghanistan for the past 12 years, and I think everyone in the audience will acknowledge that there is a bit of exhaustion and fatigue with Afghanistan. It's a very difficult problem, but it's certainly one where we can see there's been definite progress on things like access to education. The economy has grown. People have returned to the cities. The cities are growing. I'm here in Kabul right now, which probably had a population of, let's say, around 800,000 or maybe 1 million under the Taliban. After the fall of the Taliban, now today the city is about 5 times as large, although there's not been a reliable census in a long time. So
it'd be about 3 million
things going on. No, actually, it's about estimates vary, but we hear as much as between 3 and 5 million. So it's really quite a huge city at this point, and it's not the city that it was in the 80s or the 70s.
So let me ask you a question. Thank you for that apt summary and ground level perspective of of the political, the military, the economic, the strategic issues. And the thing that you didn't mention, and I want to start out by asking, is any reference to the guerrilla that still seems to be in play and threaten a lot of the other hopeful solutions or outcomes in Afghanistan. And of course, I'm referring to the poppy production and opium trade. And while we know that this has not been curtailed, we also know that the government does make some money from it. Most of the reporting focuses on the fact that the dissidents, and of course the Taliban at the head of the list, benefit from this global enterprise. And as you talk about things that have changed in the last 12 years, has this changed, or does this guerrilla still remain active, violent, and threatening in Afghanistan in 2014?
No, you're absolutely right. This is kind of the gorilla in the room, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime does a very good survey every year of opium production and opium planting. It's definitely worth it for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive on the opium economy here in Afghanistan. It's continued to go up, and certainly that has provided a lucrative source of income for both for the insurgency as well as for criminal groups. And there's a lot of intermingling, what we understand, between both the Taliban, a political group dedicated to seizing power from the government, and criminal groups in terms of the way they do financing, how attacks are sometimes organized. And it's really remarkable that we've had places where fighting has flared up that previously had been seen as, let's say, very unfriendly to the Taliban. Places like Badakhshan province in the northeast of the country. This has also been a place where the theory goes, and it's very hard to get good and reliable information on it, that opium and narcotic smuggling crossing over the border into Tajikistan, which is sort of a way station for Afghan opium and heroin on its way to Europe through Central Asia and Russia. This is where this is happening right now. So, it's really been surprising to see a serious decline in security. The effect is being felt a little bit on the other side of the border in Tajikistan as well. So I think you're right. And the opium-growing heartland of Helmand province,
yes,
still remains extremely violent. It has the most violent districts in the country. It's still a very dangerous place. There was a pretty serious effort in Sangin district this summer, and some other parts of Helmand by the Taliban to really mass forces to try to push out, seize checkpoints and checkposts and outposts from the Afghan National Army and police, who are now nominally in the lead and in most places are in charge of most security operations. They were pushed back, but at some cost. And the Afghan Army and police had very high casualties last year. And the question is going to be, will the Afghan government be able to sort of sustain this this large army and police that's basically been trained up? You can teach somebody how to fire a Kalashnikov. You can teach them basic infantry skills. You can give them pickup trucks to move around. You can give them radios so they can communicate. But at the end of the day, if international funding dries up, you end up with a situation you kind of saw in 1992. Basically, the Soviets withdraw in 1989. And then it took a couple of years, actually, for the regime of Najibullah to fall. And it really was the drying up of Soviet fuel assistance, the collapse of the Soviet Union, their main sponsor, that led to the sort of total collapse of that government.
So that raises the question, which is one that occupies not only me, but a lot of other people who are either Afghan watchers or certainly Afghan stakeholders. And that is, if you just look ahead, as you say, there's going to be a precipitous military withdrawal the end of 2014. If we're now just projecting only a year ahead from an Afghan perspective, not an outside, not a NATO, not a Soviet, but an Afghan perspective, what might be the difference, or would there be any difference between the view of the decade-long Soviet occupation from 79 to 89 and what has effectively been the American-led NATO war from 2001 to 2014? And I think especially with reference to your question about the impact of the withdrawal of aid as the drawdown of military forces takes place.
Great question. And in part, that plays into one of the other things that's at work here right now. President Hamid Karzai has refused thus far to sign a bilateral security agreement with the United States that would allow a small residual U.S. force and some NATO allies to stay in the country to conduct counterterrorism operations and help train their air force and a few other things. And one of the reasons I think that he's avoided doing that is because he's very mindful of his legacy and he doesn't want to be seen as a Western puppet. He was brought to and installed with the backing. He came in with American assistance, and then went on to win a presidential election in 2004. Okay, so yeah, so how would people perceive the sort of 79 to 89 experience versus the NATO 2001 to 2014 and possibly beyond? Well, for starters, I think people vote with their feet. Afghanistan had an enormous refugee population outside of its borders, primarily in Pakistan, but also in Iran, during the 79 to 89 war. Millions of people were displaced, and the casualty toll was really, really high. I think it needs to be a crucial distinction between the Soviet way of war and the American way of war. Both of them tried their own experiments at what you would call counterinsurgency, or the Soviets probably would have called anti-partisan warfare. And while certainly NATO has had incidents of civilian casualties that have been inflicted in airstrikes at checkpoints on the roads, I do think that, especially in the glare of 24-hour international news media, it's not possible for a country like the United States or European countries who are part of the coalition to get away with the kind of, let's say, massed fires that were used by the Soviets, what do you call it, cluster bombing, or sort of indiscriminate use of artillery. Certainly, there's no doubt that the U.S. And its allies have caused a lot of civilian harm. People have been killed. Innocent people have been killed in raids. They've been killed by getting too close to coalition convoys. They've been killed when bombs have been dropped on their houses.
So mention especially what the impact is on the Afghan of the drone warfare. That's one thing you haven't discussed yet, although you alluded to it, I think, when you said people who are innocents killed by weapons when they're too near to combat zones. But specifically on the issue of drone and drone warfare, which has gotten a lot of attention, do you think that these, if they continue, and there's no, at least I haven't read any statement or heard any pronouncement by an American or NATO official that drone attacks will cease after the ground forces are withdrawn. So if those forces, if that form of warfare continues, and it obviously will continue to produce casualties, what will also be the, shall we call the casualty of warm diplomacy or softening of hearts, if in fact drones kill people on the scale they have in the last 10 years? Yeah.
Yeah, most definitely, and this is a question. It's a good question because it touches on both perceptions, and not only in Afghanistan but in Pakistan as well, where the ongoing drone campaign has been a super lightning rod in Pakistani politics. It's been incredibly unpopular, and which formally the Pakistani government likes to routinely protest. Okay. So the question is going to be whether or not Afghanistan continues after 2014 to even be what you call, like, what people in the counterterrorism world would call a platform for these kinds of operations, whether it be drones or counterterrorism strikes. It's kind of interesting to note that, for instance, the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, was launched from Afghanistan, from the eastern city of Jalalabad. But in order to have drones and special operations troops and all these other things, you need to have a base. And it's not just as simple as having a piece of land, an airstrip that you can launch things from. You need to be able to protect and defend that base. And that means that you've got to have a contingent that is dedicated to force protection.
Perimeter defense.
You have to have, right, perimeter defense. And then you need to be able to have the resupply that's safe. Yeah. You need to be able to do a lot of different things. So it's kind of like the self-licking ice cream cone, to use like the favorite military term. You can't just have a limited number of X number of special operations troops. They're not totally self-sufficient. They need either some kind of conventional support or some kind of base to operate them.
Yeah,
so
logistical support.
That leads to friction in communities where the bases are. That creates targets. Let's say Bagram Airfield, which is north of Kabul, giant air base. It's a city of well, it's grown enormously. It began as a tent city over 12 years ago, and now is just this sort of American mini mall almost behind the blast walls. Um, these are kind of these are hard, difficult things to maintain. Bagram, for instance, is occasionally or sporadically shelled from the outside. And yes, if there are counterterrorism strikes, especially by drones, they demand to have some kind of intelligence behind them. If the intelligence is bad, the target is probably going to be wrong, and you may end up killing somebody. You may end up killing a civilian. You may end up killing a family. And this is what Hamid Karzai has presented himself as, the defender of Afghan sovereignty, who said that he wants to be the one who makes sure that Americans can't kick down doors at night in Afghan homes and round up or arrest or kill Afghan citizens. He's sort of staked his claim on this. And this is the real question mark, whether or not there will even be this so-called platform. You can launch drones from other places. They loiter in the air for a very long time. You don't necessarily need to have a base. But typically the ones that are the most widely used are launched and recovered from air bases. So, yeah, this is going to be a long-term issue. And I'm not quite sure if policymakers have sorted out what the other option is. And I'm not also sure as well if U.S. policymakers see Afghanistan, that is America's national interest in Afghanistan, outside of these kind of narrow perimeters of needing a place where we can conduct these kinds of missions.
So actually, you mentioned Pakistan. I just wanted to not lose that thread of conversation, because I do think a lot of what happens in Afghanistan impacts Pakistan, but vice versa. And most of my time has actually been spent in those other two countries, meaning Pakistan and India, which has not been mentioned so far in our interview. So I guess the question, so if drugs are the big gorilla question about economic and diplomatic issues, I think the larger sort of regional issue is can there ever be a stable government? I won't call it a peace, but let's say an ongoing, durable government in Afghanistan, as long as Pakistan, and I was just there recently, 4 months ago, and I have many Pakistanis who've been educated in America, either the United States or Canada, but they still say, without being pressed very hard, our real enemy is India, and as long as India is a threat, Afghanistan has to be controlled for Pakistani interests. So my question to you is, will Afghanistan ever be a contingent resource for American planning, as long as we do have the perception in Pakistan, maybe not so much in India, but we haven't mentioned Kashmir. For both those people, Kashmir is more of a prize in Afghanistan, but in one sense, what happens in Afghanistan also affects Kashmir. So if you think of that triangle, or quadrangle if you include Kashmir as an independent entity, how does the shift, the major shift that's going to happen this year, and of course the presidential elections, affect the prospect of Pakistan-India relations?
Well, it's a great question, because if, and that's a big if Pakistan-India relations really were to improve, it would help cut the knot in the region in a lot of ways. Because yes, you're right, the security establishment in Pakistan, I think the phrase that's often used or that's fallen back on is strategic depth. Afghanistan is its fallback. Yeah, and certainly there is a competition, but it's a soft power. There is something of a soft power competition where, India certainly has expressed interest in and wants to support development work in Afghanistan, something that's, of course, viewed with suspicion by Pakistan. Both of the activities of both countries in Afghanistan are viewed with equal suspicion on both sides. But yeah, I mean, really, what are the prospects? I think in some ways you're asking for a functioning state in Afghanistan.
Yes.
As long as its neighbors continue to see it sort of as this sort of a tempting arena for competition.
A surrogate arena.
And that would apply as well to Iran, I think to a lesser extent. And then its neighbors to the north and Central Asia, again, to a lesser extent. So Afghanistan has the rudiments of a functioning state, at least at the national level. It's got a national army and a national police. the breakdown kind of starts to happen between the national government and the provincial level and then the district level. That is, the provincial institutions have a hard time actually extracting the money from the center so they can function and deliver services to the people. So at this point, I think this national or international experiment in trying to, it's an experiment in state building is what we've seen over the past 12 years. And it's still an unfinished one because I think there are a lot of people in Afghanistan's rural communities, at least, who probably still feel very disconnected from the government. And there have been lots of attempts and lots of money thrown at this problem, but fundamentally haven't gotten at the point where you still have a truly professional civil service.
Yeah.
You're still a long way from having a country that is self-sufficient, that can collect enough revenue that it can actually perform most of the functions of state. So I think for a long time, even after U.S. And international troops leave, Afghanistan may continue to be a ward of the international community. And that's something that Afghanistan will have to wrestle with for a long time. But if that money goes away from the U.S. and the other major donor countries, who does step in? Obviously, it will be other countries in the region.
So let's say I accept your premise and the outcome of your argument, which is that no matter what happens in the elections or in the American military withdrawal, that, to use your phrase, Afghanistan will continue to be a ward of international power players. So if that is true, and I'm going to say it is true for the purposes of our discussion, what would be the best outcome in the presidential elections to make it a useful ward as opposed to a destructive ward for international powers? In other words, how would the outcome of the election best benefit international interests at the same time, obviously, as it would help to have Afghanistan function as a state?
Well, what I think everyone hopes is that the outcome of the election will represent the hopes and the desires and an outcome that most Afghans can live with. And I think that's what everyone is hoping for in this situation. However, the international community is shying away from using the phrase such as free and fair to describe what they would like the elections to be like. I think it's something like credible. I don't remember the phrase that they now use, but it's something a little bit less than free and a little bit less than fair. It's credible and acceptable to most players here. So the ideal outcome is not one or another candidate, and certainly I'm not in the business of trying to predict how the election will turn out. But the ideal outcome, at least in the eyes of the international community and most of the Afghans, both ordinary Afghans that we speak to and Afghan officials that we speak to, is an election that doesn't become embroiled in violence, that there is not major or massive violent disruption of the election by the Taliban or by other groups, and that it is not a result that leads some of the factions, the traditional factions that fought each other in the Civil War in the 1990s, to rearm, to pick up arms again and start fighting, because that's what led to the the destruction of a considerable part of the city of Kabul and the deaths of a lot of people in the 1990s. No one would like to see a reprise of that, but if the elections are not seen as fair and they're seen as giving short shrift to one or another group, then it could be potentially dangerous.
So on this issue, which is what will concern a lot of people who will listen to the interview, one can talk in the abstract about the elections being reasonable, acceptable, even free and fair if you want to be loose in your terminology. But how do you as a reporter, or how do reporters in general who are on the ground in Afghanistan get to actually mine the results, to actually understand and review the results in a way that they can say furthers journalism instead of furthers the interest of whatever group wants you to think they won, or on the flip side that they lost and they have revenge that needs to be taken? How do you get a fair bead of what is the actual outcome as opposed to the putative outcome of these elections?
One of the institutions where we will be watching closely is the Independent Election Commission and how they respond to the results of the election. The international community had a larger role in monitoring and overseeing the 2009 election. This is much more of an Afghan-led affair, although it's internationally funded. So Yeah, there are independent election watchdogs. There are going to be people going out to the polls. All of the parties are probably going to have their own observers, or the parties to the election will also have their own observers. And we can go out and see a lot of this for ourselves. I mean, one of the great things about reporting here is, despite a lot of the security concerns, we still, at this point, have a relative amount of freedom to move around in large parts of the country. There are certainly parts, and there are even parts that are close to the capital, that are not safe to move around. But that said, I think that combine that with the fact that Afghanistan is a country that's where cellular coverage has rapidly grown, the ability for people, even in the more remote villages, to reach out to the center or reach out to us, much greater than it would have been many, many years ago, or even a decade ago. So I'm optimistic, at least, that we can try to put together something of a mosaic.
Well, that's great. And I have one final question for you, and that is, a lot of people will be thinking not only about the general issues that we discuss, military, economic, political, election problems, but they'll also be wondering about what is the prospect for Afghan women. They're obviously not going to be an Afghan woman presidential candidate, but what is likely to be some of the factors shaping the prospects for education, for jobs, for mobility, for just safety that will affect Afghan women as a result of these elections?
You're right. There are no Afghan presidential candidates, but there is one Afghan vice presidential candidate. That's Habiba Sorabi, the former governor of Bamiyan province. And that in itself is a step. The international community, the international donors have attached strings to further aid, and one of those is precisely that Afghanistan has to show kind of concrete progress on women's rights as well as minority rights. And we've seen in recent weeks and months signs of what the international community would call backsliding on this. Everything from, there was a recent attempt to revise the criminal code that would have made it much more difficult to investigate cases of domestic abuse, for instance. Mm-hmm. President Karzai, for instance, said that they would look to revise this, but there have been lots of occasions for concern for those who follow, for instance, the efforts to roll back Afghan laws that are aimed at halting violence against women. And then there are a lot of traditional and but it's still in parts of Afghanistan, in the rural heartland of the country, a deeply conservative country, where practices, child brides, for instance, can still be found. So it's a very difficult question. And I think there are a lot of women who are looking at this, exactly this election as a key one that will decide whether or not they are able to continue to enjoy some of the gains that they've made over the past 12 years, the modicum of political freedom that they've gained, and whether or not they'll be able to preserve those gains. And it's a very difficult question. It's certainly one that both journalists and members of the international community and international rights advocates will be watching very closely.
Well, thank you. I think we've just about exhausted our time, but certainly not the interests and the issues that have raised. And I want to thank you for agreeing to have this interview